This is the Unregistered podcast, and I'm Thaddeus Russell. This is a show about ideas, people, and behaviors that are considered inappropriate, out of bounds, or beyond the pale. The things you're not supposed to talk about if you're a school teacher, a college professor, a businessman, a politician, a parent, a neighbor, or even a podcast host. These are the things you're not supposed to say or even think if you're a good liberal, a good conservative, or a good citizen. Each week, I'll interview a person who has something bad to say. They might be a journalist or a professor. They might be a porn star or a drug dealer. They might just be an ordinary person with an ordinary job who doesn't care about the rules of polite society. I'm not interested in breaking the rules just to be a troublemaker. I'm interested in people who break the rules of conventional thought and to expand the scope of what is possible to say in our society. I'm interested in people who make me think. I recently sat in a beautiful apartment overlooking Lake Michigan in Chicago. I was there to interview who I consider to be one of the greatest social historians in my profession. Elliott Gorn has inspired me in many ways. His books ask questions that I have sought to answer for much of my career, and he very bravely and seamlessly integrates his own personal stories, his own narratives, the stories of his childhood and his family, with the histories he tells. I began the interview by reading the first 3 paragraphs of his very influential book, The Manly Art, Bare-Knuckle Prize Fighting in America. Here's what Elliott Gorn writes. My father was a boxing fan. Before he married, he attended weekly fights with his buddies in New York City. I suspect that his interest in the ring originated during his youth. Although he never formally boxed, Montreal's anti-Semitism in the 1920s drew him and his brothers into countless fistfights. Later, when he served in the Merchant Marine during World War II, similar provocations had similar results. Growing up in Los Angeles during the 50s and 60s, his children were heir to tales about his occasional need to defend his integrity. These stories merged imperceptibly into accounts of famous boxers, Gentleman Gene Tunney, who taught a class at Yale, Jewish champions, such as Benny Leonard and Max Baer, and the greatest fighter of them all, Joe Louis. These, in turn, blurred into childhood lessons on how to deal with a bully or an anti-Semite, as our tiny fists punched my father's open hands. I never asked him, but I am sure that he found boxing the most compelling of all sports. The agility, cleverness, and ferocity of great boxers, the courage displayed in the ring, and the drama of 2 men stalking each other fascinated him. So here is a paradox. My father, a union member who considered himself a political radical, believed that boxing should be outlawed. Countless times I heard him say that if given the chance, he would vote to abolish the sport. Yet this was not a chastened man atoning for old mistakes. He enjoyed watching televised bouts until he died. He was in fact the only person I know who correctly predicted the outcomes of both Ali Spink's fights. But he believed that boxers were victims of racial and class discrimination, that the ring encouraged violence, and that pugilism appealed to all that was barbarous in man. This is my interview with the great social historian, Elliott Gorn.
I realized that so much of my writing comes out of my relationship with him, not just the boxing book, but ever since. In a certain way, the issues that I've somewhat, for one reason or another, been interested in, labor organizing, race, go back to a lot of the things I learned listening to him and arguing with him and disagreeing with him and being, thinking, what do you know? You had an 8th grade education. I'm going off to Berkeley to be an undergraduate. You don't know nothing, kind of thing. Well, he was right about a lot of stuff. He was right about what's important, at least, and a lot of his general ideas about where things have to go. I'm still his son. So yeah, that was he was kind of a. I'll talk just a little bit. In a certain way, he was in some ways a kind of person that we don't see that much of, especially if you hang around universities. Mm-hmm. He had an 8th grade education, grew up in Montreal, Jewish Montreal. If you've ever read the novelist Mordecai Rickler, Joshua's Horsemen's, or Barney's version, I'm sorry, Saint Urbain's Horsemen, you kind of know the environment he grew up, sort of tough, working class, a little hard scrabble, not much money. His father, who had come over from what is today Moldova, was pretty poor. He went through a series of trades. I've looked him up in the city directories of Montreal, and the family moved virtually every year, and he's always listed in some other trade, whether it's a peddler or just one thing and another. I never even met my grandfather, but my eldest cousin remembers that when he died in 1950, he was raising chickens in his basement. So this goes back to a very different world. Mm-hmm. Somehow that's been very influential to me. I do think that if truth be told, there's a lot of reasons I became a historian, but I think one of them is that as a kid, pretty young kid, my father kept scrapbooks, and I was fascinated by by those scrapbooks, by the headline of the death of Franklin Roosevelt, his hero, because I think Franklin Roosevelt really for him was epitomized the possibility of America, the possibility that it doesn't have to be this conservative, button down place. But all those things in that scrapbook for 4 years during the Great Depression, he was a young man in his 20s, and I don't know how he got this gig. He never explained it to me. Somehow he was traveling on the road with Marian Anderson as she toured North America.
For those who don't know, Marian Anderson,
the great
opera singer,
operatic African-American singer. Just a magnificent voice. If you've never heard it, it's worth going to YouTube and just typing in Marian Anderson. And of course, he didn't go to the famous. He stayed for whatever reason. He stayed in, I believe, it was the Northwest, instead of going back to the famous concert at the Lincoln Memorial, where Marian Anderson had been shut out of Constitution Hall by the Daughters of the American Revolution. And Eleanor Roosevelt intervened, and she had an open-air concert at the Lincoln Memorial. Tens of thousands of people, this magnificent concert that was recorded. It's still there. And the photos, they're just amazing. Anyway, my father, for 4 years, didn't get to know her particularly well, but he drove in the same car, by train, going from place to place. And his job was to sell the programs, to hire a bunch of kids at the local YMCA or whatever, and sell programs to for the concert. Anyway, all of his stories from the 20s and the 30s and the war just fascinated me as a kid, and I think it was looking through that scrapbook.
I see a whole lot of contradictions, conflicts, binaries, paradoxes, differences that are so interesting to me. Oh, and ambivalence. That's the most important thing. So your father was would you say, raised in the 1920s, right?
He was born in 1910.
Yeah, so he's a pre-World War II Jew.
Yeah.
Okay. And you essentially are a post-World War II
Absolutely.
Jew. And I've written quite a bit about this, right? So and now I don't know exactly how the Canadian scene was differed from the American scene, but obviously in the United States, well, not obviously, but in the United States, as you know, before World War II, Jews were largely considered to be not white, or at least not exactly right.
Right.
And there was a debate about whether they were black or even something worse. And then after World War II, that all changed and became assimilated quite quickly and accepted essentially as Caucasians, right?
Right.
And that meant many, many things in many, many ways. But in one ways is that before World War II, they were primarily identified as a working class people too, right? And after World War II, they very much were not.
Yes.
They went from being street fighters, with an 8th grade education, to becoming college professors, right? The stereotypes, you fit the stereotypes, your father and you, right? Each one. And it's so interesting that happened so quickly overnight. There's that, but then there's this thing that I just read that you write about with boxing and fighting and masculinity, where for him it was a part of his life, and he was drawn to it, fascinated by it, but also apparently, I guess, he was troubled by it severely and wanted it to be banned. I mean, that's an interesting thing. And I've been training, as I told you, in boxing for about 11 years now. I've never fought, never competed, but I've sparred quite a lot. And it's the main passion outside of my life, outside of work and family and friends. It's the number one thing for me. But I have also always thought I am the craziest person on earth for doing this because, I use my brain for a living. And even if I didn't, it's a pretty terrible thing to risk brain damage. So, and then there's the masculinity piece of it, which is what your book is largely about on boxing. Did he feel like he was a tough guy? Because Jews since World War II have struggled with this, right? They've sort of struggled with their masculinity and been portrayed as the least masculine of all of our white men.
Right.
Was that part of it for him? Was that part of his identity?
Oh, I think so. I think absolutely. And I think some of our conflict had to do with how we identified ourselves or thought about ourselves. I think he was, when I knew him, he was pretty late coming to fatherhood, so he was in his 40s, 50s. As when I'm growing up, and yet his affect, his language, the way he saw the world really was as someone who grew up in pretty hardscrabble Montreal. I mean, he had stories about, especially the rivalry in Montreal was with the French, and he had stories about, literally fistfights. He had one story that always fascinated me. This is a little off your question, but it's because it does express how different our lives were. I'm guessing he was maybe 16, something like that, and he's walking down the street with two of his friends, and three other guys approach them. I don't think they were French. I think they were also Jewish. And a group of three says to the other, "Why don't we have a nice sociable fight?" And they do. They just start wailing each other, that is so far from my experience. Even though, I grew up in basically a working class neighborhood. Most of the kids' families, their parents, mothers worked in the offices, fathers worked in the shops at Lockheed, places like that.
Los Angeles.
Yeah, in Los Angeles.
Greater Los Angeles.
Yeah, basically it was a high school, a suburban high school, but most of the kids were blue collar or very low level white collar. My high school sent 5% of the graduating class to 4-year college. We were we were feeders for the factories that used to exist.
Yeah. Which high school is this?
It's called Poly High.
Where's that?
It's in the town of Sun Valley. It's right where Pacoima, San Fernando, Sun Valley, North Hollywood all sort of come together.
Just north of Los Angeles.
Yeah, it's heavily Latino now. A good friend of mine who did graduate at the same time I did and actually made some serious money in his life, just endowed a scholarship fund at Poly for kids who go to college, and a good number of them do. And his kind of let's give back, and I'm proud of him and proud of I talked with him a little bit about it and maybe helped a little bit.
But it was even essentially working class, even though it wasn't Latino when you were there.
Oh, absolutely.
Right.
Yeah. It was mixed. A few African Americans, a good number of Latinos, some Asian, Jewish, white, working class white, just very mixed. But what you say, of course, is true, and it's always. I'm not sure that when I talk to students about this, they quite get it, that they're especially in a town like Chicago, that their Italian and Polish ancestors were not thought of as white. It doesn't mean they were thought of as black. They certainly weren't, but they were not thought of as white. And that race is always a term in American history that's so slippery.
Yes.
So slimy is the word I like to use. But
it's both simultaneously. Slimy is slippery. It slips out of categories very quickly. It slips from category to category, and the categories change because they're so slippery.
Yes, and slimy because it's often used for very slimy purposes.
Pretty much always, I think.
Yeah. Pretty much. Yeah.
I have never heard of the use of it in any way that I find to be appealing. So, as to the thesis of your book, or there's multiple theses in your book. This is your first book, by the way, which was your dissertation, right?
It was.
And again, this was The Manly Art, Bare Knuckle Prize Fighting in America. Great book. I mean, truly, I think one of the greatest social histories that I've seen in my profession. But one of the things you talk about in there is, I guess how I would put it is the difference between spontaneous working class violence street fighting, that kind of thing.
Let's have a nice sociable fight.
Yeah, and things that weren't so sociable, right? But that were spontaneous, not organized, that came in neighborhoods like that among populations that were essentially working class or poor, right?
Right.
Versus this idea and practice of a different kind of violence, which is highly organized, which tends to be directed and called for by the middle and upper classes, and which is state directed, right? So things like war, right? Things like the use of police and prisons, right? So state violence, right? And so in the 19th century, and this, I would say, I think in the 19th century, for me, in my reading of it, that is when this shifts so big, and this is what your book is very much about. So the early 19th century, before the Civil War, unorganized, spontaneous, chaotic street violence was common in working class areas in the cities, which was most areas in the cities in the United States. After World War II, that began to change, right? And we began to shame that kind of violence and then move toward much larger, worse violence that killed many, many more people, but that was not only directed by the state, but sanctioned by it, and then became culturally popular among the masses. War. Right, beginning with the great imperialist wars against Spain in 1898 and going all the way through the 20th century up to the present moment, where the NFL, every Sunday, all the coaches are festooned now in camouflage, right? Yeah. It's one of the most terrifying things I've ever seen. And that's all fine. So murdering thousands or millions of people often became not only okay, but celebrated, while street fighting is looked down upon, which is so interesting to me, right?
I think it's true, and it's not that street fighting has disappeared. There still are, of course, poor and working class neighborhoods, and so on. But it's not exactly that one displaces the other. But yeah, you're right. One becomes much more legitimated, a kind of culturally sanctioned, and the other, especially for the middle class, is sort of looked down upon as just as so horrifying, and. Well, yeah, it's probably not good that people are brutalizing each other personally, but let's have a little perspective here where the real damage, the real human damage comes in between state-sanctioned violence and street violence. We sort of we do lose proportion. That's for sure. Yeah, and that's that transition that you described. Yeah, that's been part of things that I'm interested in and very much was, and that also has to do with a lot of things about class, but again, masculinity also. It's interesting how we had such a wonderful and important beginning with second wave feminism in the academy transition in terms of thinking about the importance of gender. But masculinity is part of that. There are two genders, actually. We're more complex than that. But masculinity has always sort of not been thought about and talked about in the same terms, in all of its valences and subtleties, and how it then relates to not just masculinity in terms of performance by individuals, but how masculinity becomes part of the larger culture. Yeah. Let me just, for example, the phrase to people in the military, and it's not undue. Thank you for your service. It's not undue, though. I have a former student who went to the Naval Academy, was in the service, and so on, and it drives him nuts that he's thanked for his service as a military person, but never as a teacher, the same way. So
right. The new Renegade University has new courses on the history of race in America, the politics of sex work with Maggie McNeil, an introduction to Nietzsche with Daniel Coffeen, and my new What is Postmodernism course. We also have a large catalog of courses featuring my Renegade History of the United States series, Scott Horton's courses on American foreign policy, and my histories of the United States in the 19th century and of World War II. We're also about to release 2 brand new courses, The History of Martial Arts with Daniele Bolelli, and An Instructional Design for Dying with Tom Nickel. But what makes Renegade University fundamentally different than all other online universities and even most brick-and-mortar universities is that you get to talk one-on-one with us, the instructors, via what we call office hours. Students and members of RU also can talk to each other on our very own social media platform, which is completely free of censors from Facebook or Twitter or the government. At Renegade University, you can say exactly what you want to say. So join us. Become a member. Go to renegadeuniversity.com. And right now, for a limited time, we are offering 30 to 40% off everything at the brand new RU as part of our grand launch sale. So join the revolution and go to renegadeuniversity.com. One of the things, maybe the thing I liked the most about your book, and I think it was celebrated by this, not just by me, is that I believe it was the first book to, and you just mentioned this, to examine masculinity in this way, to think about it seriously. Now, gender studies, the idea of gender had already been invented or constructed by feminist scholars beginning in the 1980s, and they wrote many books and articles on women and gender, which were pioneering and path breaking, and I couldn't do my work without that, nor could you. And I think, but you were the first one to look at the other gender, right? And seriously, isn't it? I mean,
I don't know if I'd say
your book came out in 1986. That's very, very early.
It's early, yes.
To be writing about even just gender. There was very little even on women by that point. But I don't know of another monograph that focuses on masculinity the way that you do and uses it the way that you do.
I don't think there was a scholarly monograph. There were a few academics who were sort of playing at the edges of it and doing some interesting stuff. Mm-hmm. But it was sort of just how are we going to think about this stuff? Yeah. So it comes out just before the famous article, Joan Scott's article on it has that enigmatic title, "Gender is a Useful Concept," right. And it's a justly famous article. So yeah, it's sort of at that moment, and I think maybe some people, I don't think too many, but maybe some people thought I was some sort of retrograde, guy's guy kind of thing. And I certainly don't think I am. I didn't mean to be anything like that. I'm a college professor. I'm an academic. As I've told you many times, why do you want to do this interview? I'm a boring guy.
It's super boring. Yep. You've written how many books on the most fascinating topics?
There's the proof right there.
Oh, I see. So here's the thing. I love this. You're a brilliant writer, and I hope that came out in my reading of the first 3 paragraphs of your book. And that's another reason that you are considered to be one of our finest. But you use this great phrase in the book to describe boxing at a particular moment, a transitional moment. It was first looked down upon by the ruling elites, and then that sort of shifted later in the 19th century. But for a while, boxing, you say, was, quote, an oppositional way of life. What did you mean by that?
Well, part of an oppositional way of life, yeah. What you were describing, what we were talking about, a kind of street culture that's thought of as beyond the pale, but it's embedded in, especially for men. And this is an era before what we call companionate marriage. This is an era when both genders, men and women, even married couples, spent an awful lot of time apart from each other. Mm-hmm. Men would be out there in the saloons and in the volunteer fire companies and involved with politics, street politics. Mm-hmm. And boxing was part of that, these tests of masculinity and all of that was tied into ethnicity, of course, Irish versus an Anglo boxer, native-born Americans versus the Irish. That becomes a whole big part of this story. So yeah, it's part of this kind of elemental street culture that's, again, very suspect for many people, especially for the elites who write in things like Harper's or in the famous high-minded journals of the day.
Yeah, Thomas Jefferson and Horace Greeley both opposed it, didn't they?
Yes,
and others of that.
Others at least have a mention somewhere of mentioning that this is horrible. This is horrifying.
So, are you a boxing fan still? Have you ever been?
Well, it's almost impossible to be a boxing fan anymore because there are very few good matches anymore.
It's getting better.
Is it?
Yeah.
I hope you're right. I was never a fan the way my father was, in the sense of really paying attention and really knowing who was ranked, where they were, going to club fights, going to local, whatever was local in town. I paid attention when things showed up on TV, maybe on pay-per-view, whatever it was. but I was a moderate fan. The funny thing is that a lot of my friends thought when I wrote this book that I must know an awful lot about, and I don't claim to. And no, I've never gone in the ring, and I did for a little while, a little bit of what you're doing, but I have very bad shoulders. This this side has been replaced, and this side's going to be replaced in a month. So
Okay.
I got limits.
I'll take you to the gym. We'll work it out. No, I got it for you. Kickboxing. That's what we'll do.
No, thanks. No. And I'm an old man, so.
Nah. All right. So here's a question. What do you think of the UFC?
I think it's just such a debasement of skills. You know, I do. I think it's just
Elliot,
such a debasement of skills.
I liked you so much.
I was a good guy for a while.
Really?
Yeah.
I think you haven't watched it.
I think you're right.
Enough, at least.
No. Because it's unwatchable. But I can't stand all the hype around it. Also, that's part of it too. That's as if boxing was never hyped. Or boxing was such a hype sport always, and so it was boxers and promoters and so on were always so aware of how the ring is a pageant, and you've got to. So I shouldn't complain about UFC that way. It's just an extension.
Well, at least your complaints were not what John McCain's complaint was. Do you know what that was?
I don't remember if I did.
He called it human cockfighting.
Oh yeah, human cockfighting. Yeah,
and in using that argument, he was calling for banning the sport.
Yeah.
So it's very reminiscent, right, of what was said about boxing in the early 19th century by people like
absolutely.
Jefferson.
Oh yeah,
Greeley.
absolutely,
Okay.
Absolutely. But at its worst, when it's kind of cage fighting, all this, I mean, there's boxing and there's boxing, and there was in the 19th century too, where there really were skilled guys, and there were real matches. And then there was just, all right, let's just get some blood going here, and maybe that's where my prejudice is against you. And you're right, I need to pay more attention.
It's okay.
I
was
will.
just curious.
I will.
We'll go to a UFC fight sometime.
Let me point out too that the UFC rules are much closer to bare knuckle rules than the regular.
Oh sure.
Regular, Marquess of Queensberry rules. It's much more wrestling, and.
I will tell you right now that they are the most skilled athletes on the planet.
You believe that?
Oh, I know it. I know it because I train with them. Yes, and I watch it.
Interesting.
Oh yeah, there's no doubt about it. And I've followed many, many other sports, and this includes basketball.
Uh-huh.
Oh yeah, they are the most skilled and I think the most athletic and the most intelligent of all athletes right now. Yeah.
Interesting.
Professional athletes, the highest level ones are. It's quite amazing what they're accomplishing now, just as athletes. Then you edited a collection of essays several years later, also on boxing, about a particular boxer, a guy named Muhammad Ali. Some of you may have heard of him. Now, I just wanted to talk about one thing in here. Well, actually, no, I wanted to give us just your basic take on Ali, because I have been revising my own thinking on him recently. And I'm curious, sort of how you're thinking about him now and what you were saying in the book at the time, which was published in 1995.
Yeah, and actually, I just edited that book.
Right.
I didn't have anything except a very short introduction in it. It was kind of an interesting story that I decided this, Ali, this was just before the Atlanta Olympics when Ali's stars started rising again.
Okay.
He was actually a bit of a low ebb in his popularity. He had been reviled during the Vietnam War. And something of a comeback in his career and in his popularity. But in the early 90s, say, in some ways he was like a lot of other ex-fighters who were well thought of, but probably going to be, forgotten, or if not forgotten, not widely remembered. And then there was just this comeback, and part of that was on the strength just of his personality. I mean, this is one of the most charismatic men of the second half of the 20th century. So I was told by his biographer then, Tom Hauser, I had invited him to come speak about Ali. I was just curious, Muhammad Ali in American culture, what's his place? Where does he fit? And just to have a few people who thought about sports, thought about boxing, to come and speak about him. And I was teaching at Miami of Ohio then. And Tom Hauser said, no, I can't make it, but as a courtesy, you should ask Ali to come. And here's the fax number of his good friend Howard Bingham. That's how you get Ali. So I fax Howard Bingham. And I don't hear back until 2 weeks before the conference in 1994, I believe it was. And then I get a call one day from Howard Bingham. What are you doing? I said, well, we're just talking about Muhammad Ali's place in history. And I don't have a lot of money for this. All I can do is, get you guys an airplane ticket and a hotel room. And he thinks about it. He says, "Okay, we'll come." And I go down in a university van. I drive down to Cincinnati Airport. Miami of Ohio is near Cincinnati, and they're coming into the terminal off the plane. Howard Bingham and Muhammad Ali. Ali is signing autographs.
Incredible.
And I drive. I get them in the van. It's a university panel truck, university van, And I'm driving back up, which is about an hour drive, and they had done this to others before, but I didn't know that. It's a trick they like to play. Ali is just to my right. Bingham is right behind me, and Bingham is leaning in. We're talking. Ali falls asleep. He's wearing shades. He falls asleep, and he starts, after he's sleeping a while, he starts hitting the door with his hand. He's a big, strong man. He's not too long out of boxing, and he's just a big man. And Howard says, "Oh, it's good he's sleeping. It's good he's catching up on his sleep. That's good." And then I say, he starts hitting the door, and I says, "Oh, geez, I hope he's okay. I hope he's taking his meds," because he had that Parkinson's syndrome. And he starts hitting it really hard. And Howard says, "Oh, this isn't good. This isn't good." Last time this happened, he starts reliving his fights in his mind. Next thing I knew, he had the driver. It was a driver like you, young guy like you. He had the driver down on the floor of the car. He was fighting him. He was reliving his. And it's just that moment. Ali lifts up his shades, looks at me, and says, "We had you." Now,
a little college professor. You poor
oh
guy.
my God, yeah, little guy, and he had me. I mean, they had me for sure. And this is something they've done with others. I wasn't, the only one and they love to do this. But then Ali and Bingham were there at the conference for a couple days, and paid attention, interacted with everyone, listened, and it was great. It was just great. Driving. One moment that everyone who was there remembers, everyone who was participant, a bunch of academic geeks like me mostly, that we're driving in the van, and a kid in Oxford, Ohio, there was a small black population in Oxford, and a couple of kids see him, and they just yell out, "Muhammad Ali!" And Ali says to me, "Pull over." And he just goes and spends some time with these kids.
No kidding.
Yeah, it was really something. It was really something.
Yeah, I mean, certainly in retirement, he came across publicly, and according to stories like this, just as a very warm-hearted and generous person. Now, you can see some of that in his public persona while he was fighting. However, I have come to the conclusion that Muhammad Ali, in general, especially during the height of his career, was an asshole.
He was a championship boxer.
Yeah. Now I know
that comes with the territory. Some of it. You're going to try to beat on other people. You're going to try to get in their heads.
But he sort of invented and one of the authors of one of the essays in your book says that, and he's right about this, that he introduced white America to the art of the dozens, which is the African American, tradition of basically
a version of it. Yeah.
Yeah. Right. Of comic put downs, basically. Right. I think that's right. But I cannot forgive him for what he did to Joe Frazier.
I think that's right.
I don't mean in the ring. I'm talking about what he said about Joe Frazier.
He humiliated him.
The humiliation, but the particular way in which he did it was actually flat out racist.
It was.
Okay, good. We agree.
Oh, yeah. No, I agree with that.
Yeah.
I agree with that.
So look, we can talk about it. So, I mean, what did he do to Joe Frazier? I mean, he called him a gorilla. And actually, before one of the fights, he held up in a press conference, he held up a toy gorilla, and he started punching it in the face and saying, "This is what I'm going to do to Joe Frazier," right? And I called him ugly. Yeah. I mean, in ways that racists talked about blacks. And I have nothing to say about that except it's terribly unfortunate. I wish that all of the Ali worshipers would take account of that, at least.
I think that's true. And no one deserves how he talked about Joe Frazier. At least Joe Frazier, who was a pretty decent guy, and came from a much poorer background than Ali, much more working class background. No, I think that's true. Ali was self-absorbed. He could be racist that way, thoughtless. But talking about personal violence and personal offense. Mm-hmm. and the states' war again in Vietnam.
Yes.
Well, he came forward when it was hard to come forward.
And then again, he is my greatest hero for saying no Viet Cong ever called me a nigger.
Exactly.
And going to jail.
Yeah. No,
for refusing to fight.
Yeah, he didn't go to jail.
Or he lost his career. He almost went to jail.
Yeah, he lost. He could have gone. He was ready to go.
Right.
He could have fled to Canada. Wouldn't do it. Was convicted. Spent 4 years in exile from the ring, awaiting a decision as to whether he would go or not. That took some serious guts, and people forget that. And I actually finally did just write something about Ali that just showed up in a academic book, that was part of my education. Ali was really part of my education. I opposed the war pretty late. Because it was Lyndon Johnson. It was the great Lyndon Johnson who brought us the Great Society. How could I think about this man as doing something wrong? And it took me a long time to see the war clearly. I mean, way too late. And Ali helped me see that. And I think that was really important. That yes, with all his flaws and this uneducated man. He showed me he was right. He saw clearly, and he saw it through a racial lens too. That's the other thing. You're right about what he said about Joe Frazier. It was terrible. But when you read him talking about Vietnam, he sees it through a racial lens. Exactly what you just quoted.
In a sort of in an anti-racist way, right?
Right.
But with Joe Frazier, he was a racist in that way, I think. So yeah, what were your politics at that point? Were you an FDR liberal just like your dad?
Yeah, basically.
Okay,
yeah.
so that was the problem.
Yeah, that was the problem. It probably still is to a certain extent. I look at the political landscape today, and it's kind of like, yeah, of course we got a real left going in, or some kind of left going in the Democratic Party. But no, we just got to beat Trump. We just got to beat Trump. We just got to beat Trump. I'll do anything. I'll compromise with anyone.
Yeah. Well, I was thinking more about how there's a willingness, I see at least on the left, to compromise a whole lot to basically let presidents and senators and congresspeople fight wars and kill lots and lots of brown people all across the world if they get public housing and welfare, right? And or maybe the promise of free education in this case,
and maybe just lip service to that,
or just And so I find that particularly disgusting.
It is, and I don't say too many bad words about Barack Obama, but for example, thinking about class and labor. Labor was terrible during those 8 years. There were promises. This is going to be our chance. And those were terrible years for labor, for organized labor, I mean.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
The other thing about Ali that I very much love is that he brought what I would call sort of African-American vernacular style to that sport.
Oh, yeah.
And I don't mean just in the way he spoke, although that was very much a part of it, but in the way he fought, the way he moved in the ring. No one had ever seen that before.
Right.
And pretty much everyone since then, certainly American boxers, has emulated him to some extent. There's been a new style of boxing. He truly changed the game in the way that one moves in the ring. And it comes from, I think, African-American popular culture. There's a looseness of limbs that he used. There's a fluidity, a rhythm.
Quickness.
And also there's a valuation of style.
Yeah.
There are many things he does in the ring or did in the ring that he didn't need to do, but he did just for the sake of style. And I think you see that in a lot of basketball players, some football players.
Yeah.
And, often it just has been racialized. It's very rare to see that among white players. I think that because the differences in the two cultures, white culture, if there is such a thing, has tended to say that we must be very disciplined and orderly and rational and good citizens. And so anything that is superfluous, like style, does not belong in a place like a military or in a boxing ring or on a football field, because we've got to get the job done and just be efficient. So efficiency is paramount, I think, for the sort of formal, usually white culture. And Ali and a lot of black athletes since him have said no, and just the way they move their bodies. And I think that was quite revolutionary and liberatory in a lot of ways, and certainly made sports more fun to watch.
Yeah, I think that's true. I mean, it is kind of the conflict of we'll turn from boxing to football just for a second. I was reminded recently of that expression that Vince Lombardi used.
Yeah, exactly.
When you score a touchdown, act like you've been in the end zone before, meaning drop the football and walk back to the sidelines.
Right.
Well, I sort of get that, that there's a sort of, this is a sport about efficiency and production and getting the job done. That's not a lot of fun, that's just not the styling part of it. I think is pretty important. And also, I always enjoy when it comes back to bite an athlete too. And your style, and someone is back in your face pretty soon. So anyway, yeah.
Yeah, well, I mean, the thing that Vince Lombardi did not understand, speaking, I think, in the 1950s when he said that, or maybe the 1960s, is that, hello, sports is entertainment.
Right, right.
And so what Muhammad Ali invented and what generations of black athletes, and many white athletes too, have done since then has been far more entertaining and has made sports the behemoth as an industry, that
it's a big part of it. It's an awful big part of it.
So thank you, Muhammad, for that. But I wish he had truly. Did he ever really apologize for what he said?
I don't think so. I don't think so. I don't. Geez, I'm not sure. I shouldn't say that. I'm just not sure.
I don't. Yeah.
I do want to say one thing though. One of my teachers. When I went to Berkeley, as an undergraduate and a couple years of grad school, and one of my teachers was a historian named Lawrence Levine, who was a great historian and just a
influence
model
on all of us.
Yeah,
who do that kind of work.
Yeah, and a model human being too. And Larry did a wonderful book called Black Culture and Black Consciousness. And in the very beginning, the introduction, he talks about the impulse to see heroes as perfect and villains as unredeemed. And he says, no, we got to get away from that. People are complicated. It's a very simple point, but it's sometimes we get away from it. Well, Muhammad Ali was a complex man.
Definitely.
That's not to forgive him. It's to say, let's see him whole. Let's try to see the whole thing.
Yeah,
so
absolutely. Yeah. To me, he's sort of became the Martin Luther King of boxers in that he's lionized and he's become an icon. And that means that we no longer even are allowed to question any part of him, right? Or it's considered to be heretical to call into question.
You're right. And no one should least of all, a geek historian. Should we be hands off?
There are no gods among us.
That's right. There are no gods.
So style, black style, like freeing oneself from the rules of boxing or the norms of society, right? That's, of course, as you know, the theme of my work often, and the theme of your work in many cases. Now, the next volume you edited, I believe it was, or at least this was just 3 years after the Ali book, was on one of my very favorite topics that I think needs to be researched so much more. And I'm so glad I think you were one of the first scholars to pay attention to this, was the McGuffey readers.
Oh, geez.
Hadn't thought about that in a while, huh?
No, I hadn't.
Selections from the 1879 edition. Boy, this sounds awfully boring and dry and academic, and there's no reason to talk about this. The McGuffey readers were textbooks used in schools pretty ubiquitously in the United States from the early 19th century until when did they stop being used?
Oh, they're still used.
They're still used.
A lot of people homeschool with them.
You're
still.
Kidding.
Oh, yeah.
I thought they were long dead.
No.
Oh, God.
There are new editions of them that come out. People homeschool with them. The real heyday, though, goes into, say, through the 20s or so, something like that.
1920s,
yeah. Maybe a little beyond that.
Yeah, so I've used the McGuffey readers, and I used to tell my students all the time, go read the McGuffey readers. If you want to understand a culture, learn how the children are taught.
It's true.
Right? To me, that's the first place you should go. And it's seems to be the last place historians go. There's very few studies of the McGuffey readers. I can't think of any, really.
I don't know of any.
Isn't that terrible?
It's awful. And we've sort of exiled history of education over to education schools. Historians and in history departments don't think about it. And it's just crazy. It's just crazy.
These were textbooks that were assigned to virtually every white school child, and then I assume eventually to black. There were sort of black versions of the McGuffey's readers that were used in the Freedmen's Bureau schools, but essentially the same messages.
Mostly, yeah.
Yeah, and this was for about a century or maybe more, right? So the vast majority of American children were taught this thing from very early ages on. So is that not important in understanding the culture? Well, you were one of the first historians to point to this. Now, tell us about the McGuffey readers and what did they say? What were the messages given to young children in America during that time?
Well, one thing we've been talking about that was in there is a kind of notion of perfection of character.
Yes.
That a person, that there's certain, there's very Victorian era stuff, and that means that walk the straight and narrow, sober self-control, hard work, that implicitly that you will succeed in life. But succeeding was not at all just material. Succeeding was being of good character, being a solid, reliable individual, reliable for business, reliable for any profession.
And for the nation state.
And and very much for the nation state, for a kind of citizen that is reliable in a democracy, because we are a democracy. And if individuals don't internalize that good character, oh my God, we've given people so much power in a democracy. That's the argument. So they're really important and amazingly popular. Just millions and millions of copies of these things handed down in towns, the old copies handed down. And all kinds of people talked about being educated on them. Some of them who become pretty radical, for example, Clarence Darrow, talked about being educated on the McGuffey readers. He becomes a socialist, and he talks about them with a kind of quaint distance when he writes about them early in the 20th century. But they were so important, really kind of amazing.
Hang on now. There's no necessary contradiction between loving the McGuffey's readers and becoming a socialist.
No, there isn't. Okay, I'm sorry.
You know what I mean?
I do.
Okay.
I do.
Because your next monograph is on Mother Jones,
yes.
right?
Yeah.
And Mother Jones is one of the most radical of American radicals ever, the most militant, I think, pretty much the most militant labor organizer and socialist, I think, in American history. Can't think of too many other. I mean, maybe some people in the Wobblies would compete with her, but I think for consistency, for the duration of her career and what she was willing to do, especially as a woman, were remarkable in that way, whether you agree with her politics or not. But you also show in the book on her, and I think you were pretty much the first to really examine this, was that she was also very socially conservative.
In some ways, yeah.
Yeah, and so that she believed that women belonged in the home and men belonged in the workplace.
Right.
And she was even opposed to women's suffrage.
Yes.
Right. So, but yet she was totally radical in terms of what we call politics, right? And I'm not at all surprised that Clarence Darrow, another left-winger, was, like the McGuffey's readers. I would bet you that Mother Jones had no problem with it either, because if you read Eugene Debs, another, the leader of the Socialist Party, if you read any American radical, you're going to find a deep social conservatism, of the socialist variety. I've never found a socialist in America who would champion free sex, really,
No.
This is at all. In fact, they're totally puritanical. So I don't see any contradiction there. Do you?
No, I don't think there's necessarily contradiction there. Let me just talk about Mother Jones a little
bit.
I mean, her radicalism is not always ideologically consistent at all. I mean, she is for a little while, not more than a little while, a member of the Socialist Party. She's a founding member of the IWW. At moments in her life,
the industrial workers of the world. Some people don't know. So it's
you're right.
Semi-anarchistic, sort of, I would call it more syndicalist, communist, I guess. They wanted to create one big union that would govern society, essentially, run by Big Bill Haywood, very legendary labor leader.
Yeah.
But they were the most militant and used violence,
They did.
union in the country at the time. So yeah. Still around too.
Yeah. I mean, for Mother Jones, in some ways the word is militant, and it doesn't necessarily mean ideologically militant, but she was consistent from the time she was a pretty old woman, 60 years old or so, when she sort of emerges as Mother Jones, as this character, to champion labor workers. Her opposition to women's suffrage is not because she opposes the suffrage per se, it's because she thinks it doesn't do any good, that voting doesn't do any good, that the political system, basically, she thinks is pretty corrupt.
Was that the reason she opposed it?
It is the reason she said it. For a while she's in favor of it. Okay. And then it's the Emma Goldman position. It's kind of, this is, I'll use the Marxist word, this is epiphenomenal. This is a sideshow, a distraction. She's opposed to women in the workplace because she thinks, and children too, she organizes the famous Children's Crusade in 1903 against child labor, because it beats down the price of labor. That she very much believes, you're right, in the traditional women in the home, men in the workplace, because labor should be paid a decent wage for a family wage, right? But by the same token, she's very much in favor and does organize women. First of all, she organizes workers, women workers, brewery workers, garment workers, and so on. But she also organizes wives of miners in what she calls mop and broom brigades to, as she says, go clean up the scabs. And this is the whole idea is that being organized, being in unions, is a family endeavor. Even if there is that division of labor where the men are going into the mines, for example, and women are at home with the children. So it's a real combination of these things. It's very, it takes a while to, sort of parse it out. We have our own expectations and our own assumptions. She's a really interesting character. And I should say that in some ways the most interesting is her backstory, which she spoke about very little in her lifetime, that she came from a family of famine immigrants from the Great Hunger in Ireland. They emigrate to North America when she's a teenager. She becomes a teacher, and she learns the trade of a seamstress. And this is a shout out to my daughter, who was a union seamstress in California.
Oh, yeah?
Works in Hollywood. Yeah, absolutely.
Huh.
And marries a man, has 4 children, and her whole family in 1867 is killed in a yellow fever epidemic in Memphis, Tennessee.
It's something else.
She comes back to Chicago, is burned out in the Great Chicago Fire. Just a life of...
And that was just a few years later, right?
Yeah, 4 years later.
Right.
Unspeakable tragedy. The famine in Ireland, and the plague and so on. And then she becomes Mother Jones. She exaggerates her age. She says she's older than she really is and wears these old Victorian dresses. It's a performance, and she's a great speaker, just a hellfire speaker. And she organizes workers, especially miners, and she's completely fearless about violent West Virginia, Colorado, violent labor strife, and she's completely fearless.
And she's advocating for the use of violence by strikers.
She would say no. She says at one point, I hate violence, I prefer drama. And yet, there are moments when she says, they're shooting at us, go get your guns, boys.
Yeah, exactly.
So, yeah.
Now, all right. I mean, so let's talk about just sort of what unions are for a second, and I started out as a labor historian, and I had all sorts of critiques of the labor movement in the 20th century after the violent era, sort of post World War II. The violence receded very quickly. Before then, it was full of violence, lots of violent strikes, we are told, in which capitalists lined up machine guns and shot down workers in various scenes, including many, especially in the coal mine areas. And that's where Mother Jones focused her attention. Now, the thing is about trade unionism is that it depends on the threat of violence, I believe. There's no way to ensure that scabs will never cross the picket line and take your jobs when you're on strike unless you stop them from entering that building, right? Entering that workplace. So it's funny when the graduate students and the adjunct faculty have tried to organize, and these are movements I've been a part of. I would tell my colleagues, who are trying to do this, I would say, look, I'm totally happy to organize a union with you, but you do understand, at the end of the day, they're going to try to replace us with replacement teachers. And how are we going to stop those people from taking our jobs? Now, we could try to shame them and tell them it's a very bad thing to take the job of a striking worker, but these are people who also need money. These are people who also need to make a living, just like us. If we don't succeed in shaming all of them, which is what's necessary to make our strike or the threat of a strike powerful, we're going to have to link arms at the very least and block their entrance into the building, which is a form of violence. And if they try to push through, we're going to have to push back. And if they hit us after that, then we're going to have to, it escalates. And this is exactly the kind of stuff that Mother Jones was embroiled in, except on a mass scale, in which real violence actually did break out because they weren't a bunch of academic eggheads who had never thrown a punch before. Right. Right. These are my people, coal miners. I'm descended from coal miners. In Iowa. And they were involved with the United Mine Workers and John Lewis. And I'm sure they threw a few punches and maybe even threw a few bullets at people. So, does that make sense to you, that there's a threat of violence at the end of the trade union mission there?
Sure. Or it gets so buried, so hidden.
It's implicit. Yeah.
Like you say, the violence that's there in the earlier era, well, it's there before the Wagner Act and before the federal government says, okay, you can organize unions. It's okay. You are a legitimate power to do that.
In the 1930s, the Wagner Act.
Yeah, I'm sorry, in the 1930s, the Wagner Act, and subsequently during the post-World War II era, until union membership starts declining, the federal government had, if not always, completely supported labor, had legitimized organized labor, and that meant that violence could subside because there was, the federal government said it's okay to organize a union,
and they regulated it,
right,
and held elections that they monitored,
right,
and so it was brought under the auspices of the federal government, and
right,
which then that was in large part an attempt to regulate the violence out, to keep the violence at minimal,
right, and that of course gradually changed as unions have been destroyed, broken up. The numbers of people in organized labor has declined so much, and there hasn't been much of a response yet. And we'll see what kind of. By response, I mean labor has not found its feet since then. Some white collar workers, SEIU, there are unions that have had some success. But the numbers of workers organized has been declining and declining and declining. It's just under 10% of private sector now, a little under 10%. I mean, at its height, it was a third of private sector workers, which is, you don't need everyone to be organized for it to have ramifications through the whole labor force.
Right. So my theory for why that happened, the decline of American labor, is it's not really about repression by employers, because there was more than enough repression before this happened by employers. This is what you write about.
There was.
The actual use of machine guns.
Oh, absolutely.
That hasn't happened really since World War II, when it declined. So to explain employer repression as the cause of the labor movement, it seems odd to me, but which is what most people do. My first book on Jimmy Hoffa makes the argument that the decline happened. Well, we know the decline happened in 1955. It began in 1955. So you see a chart of union density.
Yeah.
The percentage of workers who are in unions, it goes up until 1955, and then it goes down ever since. What else happened in 1955 was the merger of the AFL and the CIO. So before then, and this is what my book is about, those two federations and all their member unions were in these dogfight wars between each other to gain union members. So they would descend upon a particular business or an industry, and 2 or 3 or sometimes even 5 or 6 unions would be competing to recruit members into their union so that they get the dues. The AFL-CIO merger ended all that, made it illegal internally for any 2 unions to be rivalrous with one another, to compete for members. Now, if you know anything about market competition, right, you know that's death, right? And the unions in this case are basically they're basically service businesses, right? They're providing a service in exchange for dues money, right? And I think that's why they became less accountable, because they didn't have to be, because they no longer faced competition, and they stopped serving their members. But that's just my theory. Well,
it's a good theory, and it's all under the umbrella of the Wagner Act, of the National Labor Relations Board. There's really, if there's a revival of the labor movement in America, it's going to be outside the Wagner Act. It's going to be outside the NLRB. It's going to be returning to maybe something like what you're describing, where organizations that are a little bit renegade and a little bit, bit outside the what's sanctioned by the government, is going to try to start organizing people at Amazon and places like that.
And I'm just saying, workers at Amazon, and if professors want to keep unionizing, they better learn some boxing skills. That's all I'm saying here.
That might be true. And let me just say one other thing. The one phrase that drives me crazy in today's conversation: good jobs, right? Good jobs were terrible jobs. Working in a steel mill is awful. In a car factory.
Can you tell
awful.
Bernie Sanders that?
Yeah,
and Donald Trump, by the way, who both want to bring back the factory, apparently.
Yeah, which what made them good was the union. That's all that made them good. Maybe. They paid a decent wage. They were awful work. They were always awful work. Right. And they got a little better, a little shorter hours, a little safer. That was certainly important. But it was the fact that you had a living wage, and that was because of the union movement.
Middle class wage.
Yep.
Right.
Yep.
But working in a factory, Bernie Sanders and Donald Trump have explicitly stated they want to bring back factory work. But isn't that interesting? Those two guys,
Yeah.
right? And wouldn't it be great to have them fighting it out for who gets to bring back the giant steel mills? So
That's right.
And coal mines that we can all work in.
That'd be great.
That's America. There you go.
Oh my God.
Speaking of violence, your next book is on one of my very favorite topics, Gangsters. Dillinger's Wild Ride, the year that made America's public enemy #1. And this is right in my wheelhouse. So
It certainly is.
you have 2 books on what I would call 20th century rebels, one on Mother Jones and one on John Dillinger. I would say that Mother Jones was more of a collectivist or maybe communitarian, obviously a socialist rebel, right? Is that fair? Okay. And Dillinger was very much an individualist rebel.
Very much so.
Okay. So far, so good. Now, you describe Dillinger in a lot of very interesting ways. And here's another one of my favorite pieces of your writing. It's just a couple sentences. And by the way, Elliot is one of our finest writers, and he's just worthy of reading just for that.
I appreciate that, and I don't think it's true, but I'm a careful writer, and I think the most important thing for any writer, I say this to graduate students, is you got to care about writing, which means you got to care about reading.
I will say this. In our profession, in the historical profession, it is chock full of what we call antiquarians, people who just collect information and spew it out in sort of this undifferentiated or unanalyzed narrative. But, that's not you. But the one thing I will say that I'm very proud of with my profession, and this is I think pretty much every historian, professional historian, almost everyone that I know of, even the ones I dislike, are good writers. I think we are the best writers of all the...
I think we're probably the best writers, but that doesn't mean we're good.
I think we are. Well, I think we are.
As a profession, that's interesting. I would disagree. I don't think there are that many good historical writers. I think.
Really?
Well, to me, good means that what does Skip Gates say? Could your mama read it? Would she read it? Well, and I think that's a fair.
Would your mama read it?
Can you get beyond our profession, all the other academic geeks,
all right.
and into, and even if you don't succeed in doing it, could someone pick it up and say, oh yeah, okay.
All right. Well, except with maybe the use of 2 words in this little section, I think my mama would like to read this at least. Okay. This is what you say about John Dillinger. His story evoked the picaresque heroes of fiction. The picaro was a man of low birth who made his way up the social ladder with laughter, cunning, physical bravado, and sexual prowess. Most of all, Dillinger embodied the American road trip, that liminal journey filled with freedom and adventure, even sex and violence, set apart from the crushing ordinariness of daily life. Dillinger proved that the old American fascination with movement, with flight, with lighting out for the territories was still alive, still glorious, even if the journey lasted only long enough to flame out and die. To die, his friends would add, not like a rat, but like a man.
Well, except for liminal and picaresque.
Exactly. Those are the two. Those are the two. But you might want to start writing for Hollywood. That's pretty damn good. But aside from me waxing on about your writing skills, flesh this out. Like, what did you mean by this? But I think you are completely on. This is how I read the Gangsters too, of that era of the 1930s, and I've written about them. But go ahead.
Well, let me say this. When I pick a topic to write about, it's about the topic and about telling a story. There's got to be, because I just like storytelling, and there's got to be a story there. Mm-hmm. I respect historians who do, much more abstract or analytical work. We need that sort of thing, but we also need stories. But stories aren't just about themselves. They're a way of getting at something. And Mother Jones, and let me just say, I'm working with a wonderful group of people, the Mother Jones Heritage Project here in Chicago, trying to get a statue put up of Mother Jones, just to start to bring her memory back. And there's a lot of ideas and projects, and we're doing our best. But Dillinger, to me, writing about Dillinger was writing about exactly what you just said, the Great Depression. Mm-hmm. It really was. And in some ways, like I said, when I pick topics, as I sort of go forward in time, and I'm getting closer to our own day and that sort of thing, And it's kind of like, how does a subject help me tell a story that is about something more than itself? Dillinger's story, his own personal story, is fascinating. It just is. He's this charismatic guy who robs banks, but he's terribly charismatic. But he's also about the 30s. He's about this terrible crisis that's happened in America.
Can you just give the basic narrative, and then
the Great Depression, when the stock market crashes in October 1929, and then the economy slides and slides and slides. So that by the time you get to the year that Dillinger emerges after 9 years of being in prison for a theft and an assault.
And he was put in prison when he was quite young.
Quite young. He just basically reached adulthood.
So his career as John Dillinger hadn't begun yet. It was only after he was out of prison.
His career as John Dillinger lasts 1 year and he's in his just on the border of being his 20s and his 30s. He comes out of prison. It's 1933. 10,000 banks have closed, just wiping out people's savings, businesses, wiping them out. The unemployment rate today is under 4%. It was 25% then. It was, of course, worse for minorities. It was awful for everyone. And if you didn't lose your job, you certainly lost some income, some prosperity. There was so much anxiety and fear and uncertainty, and that's a big part of it. And here this guy who just seems so ballsy. just what else can you say? He's just, you have to look at some of the pictures of him to see him. There's one photo that's taken. It's taken in early 1934. He's just broken out of prison, and he goes with his girlfriend, a Native American woman, Billy Frechette, goes to his father's house for Sunday dinner under the nose of the FBI. And he poses for a photograph outside his dad's home with the fake gun that he broke out of the Crown Point jail with, and a machine gun in the other hand, and a big smile on his face, and a sharp suit, and he's wearing a nice suit. And that's how you know the story. That's all in that photo. That's in 1934. That's when the Great Depression is just grinding away at people. So what you said about, Mother Jones being much more of a hero for a cause for many people, and Dillinger, people would occasionally refer to him as Robin Hood, but most people would say, no, he's robbing from the rich and taking for himself, and that's good with me.
Yeah.
He's robbing banks, and banks are the enemy. That's a big, people say that explicitly, writing to letters to the editor and so on. So.
Yeah, he was sort of aspirational in that sense.
Yeah,
not that people necessarily wanted to rob banks,
and
risk their lives, but they wanted to get rich quick.
They hated that people got killed. They hated that this was violent. They hated that all of that. And yet at the same time, secretly, or not even so secretly, they loved them. They loved it.
Banks were not popular, and gangsters were already. This is the thing,
That's true.
Right? You know about the gangster genre films of Hollywood, which were the most popular films during that period, until the code in 1934 basically stopped that. But through the 20s and the early 30s, when Dillinger is in prison getting ready to go on his rampage, we have Prohibition. And with Prohibition, we have the rise of gangsters, not just as powerful figures and dangerous figures, but as the most popular celebrities in the United States, right? There was a poll taken by, I think it was Variety magazine, on who were the most popular celebrities in the United States, and gangsters, I think, were number 2 after movie stars. And politicians were like 10th.
It's pretty amazing. And I mean, when Dillinger dies in July 1934, what's he coming out of? The Biograph Theater on Lincoln Avenue, watching a gangster movie. That's what he was doing, that's it all really does make sense. I mean, pictures of, we think of, a little earlier, just slightly earlier, Capone, photos of him at the racetrack, photos of him at a ball game, sort of a kind of everyman, photos of Capone soup kitchens, soup lines during the Great Depression, feeding the hungry. I mean, there's you're right, there's a whole thing going on with that, and it's about all that.
It was the only time in American history when cops were the villains in movies. And gangsters were the heroes. This was in all the great. So the big movies were what? Little Caesar, Public Enemy.
Jimmy Cagney.
Jimmy Cagney. And what was the other one? White something. Anyway, there was several movies at that time, and these were the most popular movies. But in every case, the gangster, I mean, he wasn't portrayed as a saint, but it was sympathetic to him. It was told from the point of view, from his point of view, and so they tended to be biopics. where you would get this sort of sympathetic, and you would identify. They were intended for the audience to identify with the gangster. So you would show him rising through a difficult childhood and working his way up, and then eventually having and being very disrespectful of cops. There was these scenes where like Jimmy Cagney would like light,
come and get me, copper.
Yeah, he would strike a match on the cop's badge and then light a cigar with it. That's my favorite
That's great.
scene. Yeah, very just. It was an anti-authoritarian, anti-police, anti-government culture generally in this country during Prohibition, because largely of Prohibition.
Yeah.
This is why I like it so much, the 1920s. And I think that I'm wondering, and I can't remember, do you do this in the book at all? Do you look at this? Was Dillinger, he must have sort of been aware of this in prison and sort of been feeding off of it, maybe feeling like, well, when I get out, I might be a celebrity just like them.
There's no way of knowing that for sure, but it's got to be true. Okay. I mean, there's no way of knowing it, but it has to be true. I mean, he's in prison. He is subscribing to the extent that they'll let him. I mean, he wants to subscribe to magazines that crime magazine, that sort of thing. They don't usually let those in prison, so he knows enough to want it, and they know enough to not let him have it. So there would have been, but of course, immediately his friends become pretty sophisticated guys who've done a lot of different kinds of crime. Mm-hmm. And it's the Dillinger gang forms in prison, basically, before he lets out. And then he breaks them out. Mm-hmm. He manages to smuggle guns, get guns smuggled into the prison.
Yeah, he breaks out of prison right there. That's heroic.
Yeah. Well, yeah. And it's, again, these guys, in the movies, they have to die in the end. Yeah, no, they're not heroes. Yeah, no, we're not going to make it. Yeah, they are. I mean, that's it's ambivalent, but they are heroes. And they are sympathetic. Like you said, usually a poor childhood, a rough childhood, some ways in which life has been unfair, that sort of thing. It's a whole genre.
Vast majority of Americans wanted a drink, we found out, and the only people willing to sell them were gangsters. So no wonder they were popular, and no wonder the government was so unpopular by trying to impose this absurd, archaic law on them.
Yeah, people like Capone, like Joe Kennedy. Oh, sorry.
Keep going, Joe Kennedy.
Yeah, that's right.
You can always trash the Kennedys on my show anytime you want. Okay. I've made a career out of it. So
it's an honorable career.
And then Dillinger, I mean, it's a very fun story in a way, but I mean, not fun, but so what then does he do after he gets out of prison?
After he gets out of prison,
what's the year? Like, what's he doing?
This is in fall of 1933. Right, yeah. He breaks out, and he is
in Indiana, or
he is in.
Or he's from.
He's from Indiana, Indianapolis, the small town of Mooresville. Spends a lot of time. He breaks these guys out of the state penitentiary, but meanwhile, he's been arrested. He gets the guns in, and almost a couple days later, he's arrested in Lima, Ohio. And his buddies who break out of prison come and break him out of the prison in Lima, Ohio, shoot the sheriff, and then they go on their first the first big spree. And that's the first Dillinger gang. They're all arrested in Tucson, Arizona, get shipped back. Most of his friends who shot the sheriff in Lima, they get put on death row, and they are convicted. Dillinger is sent to Crown Point, Indiana, for another robbery, another crime, and he breaks out after a little while. Just this famous, outrageous, after he's sent back from Tucson to Crown Point, Indiana, there's this famous picture that goes across the nation where the chief prosecutor and the sheriff of Crown Point, Indiana, are there with Dillinger. And Dillinger is leaning his arm on the shoulder of the prosecuting attorney, and they're all smiling for the camera. And people are looking at this. What's going on? What is this? Just casual as hell, and then he breaks out. Yeah. Then he he goes to his chicken dinner with his father and his girlfriend, right? And then a couple months later, in northern Wisconsin, the feds, the FBI, and this is very much a story about J. Edgar Hoover, who's being humiliated over and over again.
Good. And another reason to love Dillinger.
That's right. In a place called Little Bohemia in northern Wisconsin, the Dillinger gang, which is reconstituted after the first Dillinger gang has been broken up. Including Pretty Boy Floyd, the feds surround them, and it's at night, and they escape. They basically go through a back window. They jump. They all escape.
That would never happen today. It's impossible to escape the police now.
Oh no, you can't. You can't do that. And that's when Will Rogers says that someday they're going to get Dillinger. He's going to stand too close to an innocent bystander. The feds are going to aim for Dillinger, they're going to aim for the innocent bystander and get Dillinger.
Wow.
Because the feds had a few people shot and killed during these attempts to get him.
Sure.
Finally, a woman named Anna Sage, who was a Romanian immigrant, they managed to basically put the arm on her so that they will deport her back to Romania if she doesn't give up Dillinger. They know that he's staying at her place, and she does. She's the so-called lady in red. It's really an orange dress, and she basically calls them and says, "We're going to the Biograph Theater. I'll be with Dillinger and his new girlfriend, a woman named Polly Hamilton." And the feds and the East Chicago police, God knows why they're there, are waiting for him, and they basically shoot him. If you're in Chicago and you're on Lincoln Avenue, where the Biograph Theater is still there, just north of Fullerton, the alleyway just south of the Biograph is where Dillinger ran when he realized what was going on, broke to his left into the alley, and he was gunned down there, right at that very spot. There used to be, and maybe there still is, I assume there still is, a kind of little commemoration at 10:22. I think it's 10:22 at night on July 22nd every year and talk of a ghost and feelings of a cold wind blowing where Dillinger died, that sort of thing.
And how many civilians were killed by him and his gang?
Something like a dozen. By Dillinger personally, probably one. Though that's in dispute.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Also, if it was only one, and if that's even in dispute, that helps explain his popularity as well. He. But it makes me wonder. But he became a sex symbol too, right?
Well, yeah, that's a part of it, and that's part of the whole masculinity thing. This is a long story too. But there was this rumor, and part of it is that the whole gang is these guys they're not celibate. They have women malls as women are referred to, who hang out with these. Gangsters. I prefer to think of them in some ways as outlaws, because the mythology, the imagery is almost like the West, like the old West. Yeah. But there's this whole thing about Dillinger that he's particularly, literally, specifically, physically well endowed. It's part of the legend of Dillinger. There's all kinds of, after he dies, there's all kinds of letters. There's this rumor that goes out there that his dick is in the Smithsonian Institution, and it's of heroic proportions. And the Smithsonian gets letters for years, dozens and dozens of letters asking about this. Another rumor is that it's in the Army Medical Museum. And then there's a rumor that it sat in formaldehyde on J. Edgar Hoover's desk.
Right.
That this kind of not symbolic, literal castration of the forces of law and order and the forces,
which is ultra ironic because of J. Edgar Hoover's history of cross-dressing, etc.
I wasn't going to go there, but
please do.
Yeah, no.
Next time you feel the calling, go there.
That's right. So again, this story is so tied up in all kinds of notions of sex and sexuality and masculinity. It's just a really interesting, and all the action of the story takes place in a year between late 1933 and summer of 1934.
Yeah. It was an outlaw country, right? I mean, that was supporting him.
Renegade America.
Yeah, for a moment. I mean, I think that's what the 20s were, in the early 30s. Yeah. Until FDR, so I was going to say, right, so your dad loved FDR, and John Dillinger is essentially the anti-FDR, right? I mean, people don't know this, but one of the major enemies of the Roosevelt administration was gangsters. Sure. And this was their primary argument for ending prohibition. They said it wasn't because we want people drinking again, it's because the gangsters have taken control because no one respects our authority anymore. Yeah. That was the main argument used by the Roosevelt administration. And then as soon as they ended prohibition, the states, encouraged by the Roosevelt administration, imposed all these extremely restrictive regulations on the sale of alcohol. Yeah. And part of that was closing the speakeasies and only giving licenses to respectable, upstanding citizens, which cleared out all the gays who had entered the speakeasies and the women who entered the speakeasies and the unseemly immigrants and blacks who were in the speakeasies and dancing that was going on and the jazz music and all that. And so you have George Chauncey, my other favorite social historian besides you, has written.
It's good company.
Written about that in the 1930s. That's his argument. I borrowed it from him. Everyone should read that book. It's called Gay New York.
It's a terrific book. Let me say, there's also another really good book. Claire Bon Potter did a really good book called about the New Deal on crime, about how central it is to the Roosevelt administration to this crime bill. And this happens just right during, they talk about Dillinger, this happens right during Dillinger's wild ride, we'll call it, the development of this New Deal crime bill. That's an important, exactly what you're describing.
Yeah. Claire, her book is, Claire Potter is her name, and she's now at NYU. She used to be at Wesleyan, but yeah, her book is wonderful, and I've used it in my book, and it's exactly what we're talking about. It's about how the war against crime really in some ways began with FDR, which makes a lot of sense to me, because that was about the consolidation of state power to me, the New Deal, at least in part. It's hard to deny that. And the centralization of the national state power. And so, ending prohibition was very much about bringing order back to the country and having people, giving people a reason to respect the police and respect the government and not strike matches on their badges. And so the code, the Hollywood Code, which was enforced from 1934 until the mid-1960s, basically banned that kind of portrayal of criminals in the movies. So you don't see, after 1934, in any Hollywood movies, any criminals looking good at all. And the cops now become the heroes. The FBI becomes the G-men, right, who are the great heroes who are cleaning up society.
And under Hoover, an awful lot of promotional work, PR work, making films about themselves. A film, which was the phrase that was repeated over and over again in the Dillinger era, and they do a film called "You Can't Get Away with It," and Dillinger is featured because he's dead now. You know,
right. So, and here's the proof. Here's his dick to show you.
That's something like that.
That'll happen to you. That's right. But I was going to say, so I mean, because of your own politics and your own political background, especially your dad's political background, I mean, did that come up in your thinking while you were writing the book? You know, that this is very much. He is the opposite of FDR. He is the ultimate villain in some ways for an FDR guy.
First of all, you're giving me credit for too much sophistication to even think about something like that.
Sorry.
But in a certain way, again, this goes back to what you started with, actually, that question about that ambivalence that I think was there very much for him. And it was lived. It was much more lived ambivalence, at least in his early life, where he was much more a kid of the streets, sort of. Boxing wasn't just something that took place in the ring; it was something that took place in the streets. For example, not boxing, but fighting. But I don't think he ever thought of it quite in those terms. And like I say, his son's not that bright, so I'm not sure I had certainly at the time thought of it.
Well, he's just boring. He's pretty bright, but
pretty
he's boring.
Yeah, he's a boring historian. Or maybe that's redundant.
Often it is.
Sorry.
No, it's okay. It's good. Yeah. So all right, and then your last book, or your most recent book, published last year, is about another topic I think about an awful lot, and I've been thinking about recently, particularly in the last couple of years, for reasons probably that you were, which is on the story of Emmett Till, which I hope most of my audience knows, at least the basics of. But Emmett Till was murdered in 1955 in Mississippi, and for allegedly whistling at a white woman. And then it became a cause celeb at first in the African-American or Negro press, it was called at the time. And most black people in this country, I think within months of that, were aware of Emmett Till. And
weeks.
Read. And it was a massive media thing among African-Americans. And this is one of the main arguments in your book, right? Is that it was, for a long time, it was only among African-Americans.
Yes.
The Emmett Till story had any resonance, right?
Yes.
So you want to talk about that?
Yeah, I mean, let me just say that the story is still often told that there's a very famous photo of Emmett Till in his coffin that his mother allowed to be taken and to be disseminated by Jet Magazine, then by the Chicago Defender, the great newspaper. And there's this assumption that you still hear. Black newspaper, yes, I'm sorry. Assumption that you still hear, and I could cite you good examples recently of, it was the seeing of that photo that's the beginning of the civil rights movement, and the scales fall from people's eyes. That's how it's usually presented. Very, very, very few white people saw that photo before 1987, before the
87.
87.
Wow.
before the video Eyes on the Prize.
I did not know that.
Eyes on the
until your book.
Prize. Eyes on the Prize uses it as the beginning of the civil rights movement, which is what most African Americans, well, I don't know if they would have thought of it as the beginning, but they certainly thought of it as a key moment, really essential. It was a very important story in the press throughout the nation, even throughout the world eventually, when Till's killers are found innocent or not guilty in the town of Sumner, Mississippi. But that photo wasn't out there, and Till is very quickly forgotten by white people. The story is he's a 14-year-old African-American kid, grew up mostly in the tiny town of Argo at the edge of Cook County, but then moved to Chicago.
Yeah, right. Mm-hmm.
It's an important distinction because Argo had an integrated school and integrated sports teams. Now, it was no paradise, nothing like that. And even block to block, it was somewhat integrated. That's an important piece of the story because, and he lived there till he was about 11 or so. Because, well, what was Emmett Till thinking down in Mississippi at age 14 when he did, in fact, his cousins say, yes, he whistled at Carolyn Bryant. He didn't do all the other things she said, all the other things she testified in court. That was apparently just nonsense. Mm-hmm. But he did whistle. And he was kind of a funny kid. He was outrageous. He loved comedy. He and his friends would redo bits from TV and radio. He loved, his favorite comedian was George Gobel, for those old enough to remember Lonesome George Gobel. Yeah. He's a little bit less kids can be, outrageous. Well, he whistles at this woman, and her husband later, a couple days later, finds out about it. He and his brother, and clearly aided by others from FBI, we're back to the FBI investigation. They come and kidnap him. They beat him mercilessly, shoot him in the head, and throw him in the Tallahatchie River. And his body weighted down. They weight down his body. A gin fan, a big industrial fan tied with barbed wire around his neck, throw him in the river. But his body rises in a few days. And this starts to become an issue. And Emmett's mother, back then she went by the name Mamie Till Bradley. She remarried and her name changes, but Mamie Till Bradley, she's not willing to let it go. She's a woman she graduated from high school. She has a civil service job that obviously wouldn't pay what she certainly was capable of more in her life, but and she does eventually become a teacher. She's this very interesting, smart, dedicated person, and she quickly does the right thing. She gets Emmett's body back from Mississippi with the intervention of the African American Congressman William Dawson. She identifies the body. It's hard to imagine what that must have been like for a mother to look at this terrible beating her son took. And a funeral takes place down on the south side, 40th and State, at the Church of God in Christ. It's still there, the building, the church. And she decides, let the people see what they did to my boy. And she has an open coffin. And literally something like 200,000 people pass in front of Emmett Till's coffin when it lies at the funeral home and then in the church over the course of a week. This huge outpouring. And 1955, African-American Chicago is this quickly growing community, migration from the South. The people who are going by Emmett Till's coffin have either migrated from the South themselves or the children of migrants. The cruelty of Southern Jim Crow was very much in their mind. Now, don't get me wrong. Writing this book, it was, you have to, it's kind of a hard thing to do. How do I depict the horrors of Jim Crow in the South and not seem to let the urban North off the hook? Because the urban North is pretty terrible. Mm-hmm. It's rigidly segregated on the South Side and the newly developing West Side ghetto. But by the same token, how can I also have to credit those people who are leaving the South. They're leaving for good reason. Mm-hmm. They're leaving because there are jobs, because the schools are better, the school session's longer. Even if it's segregated, there is more hope. There are even some jobs, like Emmett Till's father, union jobs. Mm. So they paid decently. Anyways, the story becomes bigger and bigger as there's a trial just 3 weeks after the murder in Sumner, Mississippi. Again, one of the surprises of telling this story is that the judge was a very fair man. He would not allow any of the race baiting. The prosecuting attorney really wants a conviction. But that's not going to happen in the Jim Crow South with an all-white jury. An all-white jury because Tallahatchie County, which is over 60% African American, there is not a single eligible black person who can be on that jury because not a single African American person can vote in Tallahatchie County, which is a requirement for being on a jury. All-white jury of mostly farmers, and of course they're not going to convict their fellow white men who committed this terrible murder. And then the story really explodes internationally. The USIA, the United States Information Agency, has its hands full trying to spin this story because this is the Cold War. This is the area of the breakup of colonial empires. And this does not look good for the United States, this murder and then the exoneration of these two.
Quick interjection here.
Yeah, please.
You're bringing to mind Mary Dudziak's work.
Yeah.
Right? And
yes, absolutely.
That's the argument you're just making right there, which is she has a book on this, which it's mixed, but I think the general thesis is fairly persuasive that the federal government during this period, during the Cold War, in the 50s and 60s, this is the Eisenhower and Kennedy administrations, I think she looks at mostly at Eisenhower, is they are especially concerned in dealing with the civil rights problem, the Negro problem, in terms of foreign policy, right? And so that, sort of as you were saying, the idea at that point was we have these African nations rising up against their colonial masters, and the Soviet Union and the United States are eager to jump in the place, right, of those old colonial masters. And so they're basically in a competition, the Soviets and the Americans, for these third world countries to control them, right, to take them over. And so it looks pretty damn bad if on national television, which then becomes international television, and there's stories in her book, I think, of like little villages in Africa where there's, one television and all the people of the village, hundreds of people would gather around it and watch TV coverage of the Emmett Till murder, and then later the dogs and the hoses in Birmingham. And so that the federal government, the presidents, and this is her argument for basically why Kennedy and Johnson and Eisenhower were so friendly to the civil rights movement, was that it was actually a foreign policy question.
It's part of the Cold War and part of the decolonization.
Yeah, we live in an American empire, right? And so it makes sense to me that many, if not most, of the major issues are ultimately foreign policy issues too, because it's all interconnected. So it's a very important point of this.
Yeah, no,
you brought that up. Thank you.
No, I think it really is a very important part of this story. But then let me say after this, Emmett Till is remembered. We're back to Muhammad Ali. Muhammad Ali has an autobiography where he talks about looking at the photo and his anger. And John Lewis, the congressman, and Moody, and person after person talks about this incident and this photo. People who became active in the civil rights movement. Joyce Lardner calls them the Emmett Till generation, people of roughly Emmett Till's age who saw the photo. Whites quickly forget the story. It just is, in the 10th and 25th anniversaries of the story, there's no mention at all in the newspapers or anywhere. And then it starts coming back. Mainly the work, it really starts coming back because of the work of African-American production companies doing video histories. Eyes on the Prize, and then Keith Beacham in the early 21st century does a story. Nelson, what's his first name? He does it for PBS. I'm forgetting his first name. And the story starts coming back, and suddenly people like me, who are academics, suddenly say, well, wait a minute, how come no one's telling the Emmett Till story? Where did that disappear? And suddenly, in the last 2 years, there have been something like 5 books. John Edgar Weideman, the novelist, and a couple, professional historians writing about Emmett Till.
Did you say for some reason this is happening now?
Well, that's, yeah.
I think I know the reason.
I think there are a few reasons, but I think one of the reasons, it is, I began writing this just after Obama was elected, right?
Okay, so that's a little earlier than what I'm getting at here. But I think that's why your book is the best of this new crop. But yeah.
Well, I think there's a way in which I think all of us must have been thinking about this topic right around the time. The Emmett Till story is not an uplifting story. It's not an upbeat story. It's not a civil rights story in that sense. It's a terribly depressing story. There was a hero, I think, and that's Emmett's mother, who really persists in trying to keep his memory alive and really becomes very famous in Chicago doing that. And she's a teacher. She has the Emmett Till players. She does that. But for the most part, this is not an uplifting story. sometimes I think that it was the election of Obama that allowed me, this was not conscious at all, believe me, allowed me to even think about writing a story like that and feeling it was safe. What a fool I am. What a fool. And just as the book is coming out, we have, pardon the expression, a president talking about shithole countries. And there are good people on both sides of white nationalism and so on. I really want to, you write the introduction usually last to a book. And I was struggling to characterize something. I spent a lot of time, woke up in the middle of the night thinking about a particular sentence. And I won't get it exactly right here, but I said something, let's see, how did I say it? Neither a mountain to climb nor, that was another metaphor of overcoming racism. I said racism is a shape-shifting demon that we have to wrestle over and over and over again, meaning we'll never finish. It will never go away. It will change. It will morph. It will seem to go away. It will come back in a new guise. That's what and I think that's part of the story. And
we were getting along so well.
I was about to say, I knew you were gonna.
So that thesis you just put forward right there, is very similar to Ta-Nehisi Coates' argument, which is that it's not quite as fatalistic.
No, it's not. I'm not.
But it sounds pretty close, or at least it sounds like it's in the ballpark. That racism is eternal.
I don't agree with that exactly, and I bristle when I hear people say nothing's changed.
Right.
I mean
that's Coates' thing, right? It's not only changed, it's never changed, but it will be always with us.
Right. And I admire Coates for a lot of reasons. You had talked about writing. One of the reasons I admire him is because he's taken good historical writing and made it accessible to people. Yeah. And that's, I think that I give him a lot of credit for that. No, I don't mean things haven't gotten better. I don't mean things haven't changed. I do mean that this isn't going away. It will come back in many guises, and if we're not careful, it'll come back awful.
Okay, so Till is killed in 1955.
Yes.
10 years later, 1965, we have both the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act.
Yes.
Okay, and ever since then, essentially, racial discrimination is illegal, and that has been widely enforced. In fact, now it's being over-enforced. In fact, it's being enforced in ways that it's now kind of the other way around, but
that I don't know if I agree with. But
in some fields it certainly is, like ours.
Yes. Okay. It's I don't know what the word enforced means here. By which I mean that word often implies that there's some sort of government intervention or something like that.
Well, I mean, it's mostly culturally enforced. So racism of any kind, even statements that are not necessarily racist, like a lot of what Trump says, which might be suggesting racism, but it's not explicitly technically racist, I believe, is verboten. And, this is going on, of course, in universities, right? It's impossible to say things that are even remotely connected to a racist sentiment.
Things that someone would take that way. Yes, yeah. That's true. No,
hypersensitivity.
I though, to be honest, I think that's a little bit exaggerated. We get examples of that in universities. Mm-hmm. I don't feel I'm in a university all the time, right? Mm-hmm. I wouldn't say I feel that weight as something that's always there and oppressive. I just don't think that's accurate. That doesn't mean it's not there. It just means that I think it's pretty exaggerated. And I think Trump knows what he's doing. You're right. Is everything he says that's said to be racist explicitly so? No. Are they dog whistles? Yeah, I think they are. And I think
that's the debate. I mean, yeah. I will entertain that debate whether or not they are dog whistles, but I have not heard anything the man say that is technically racist. I've heard things he has said that might be motivated by racism, but I don't want to ascribe racism to a comment like they're not sending their best, which is not racism.
That's too narrow a definition of racism. That's racism as bigotry and nothing else. Okay. And that's just much too narrow. You know, that doesn't begin to capture all the valences of it. Racism is when the south side of Chicago is rigidly segregated, and every 20 days someone tries to break out and move into a white neighborhood, and there's a bombing or a riot every 20 days back in the 50s.
Oh, in the 50s, yes, absolutely.
And the 60s, and into the 60s.
That is racism, no doubt about that.
Yes, absolutely.
The murder of Emmett Till was racism, no doubt about that.
Yeah.
We all agree.
No, I'm not suggesting nothing changes. I'm not, but I. Emmett Till's.
So why do you think it will always be a problem, racism? Why do you think it will always be with us? As a historian, Elliot, you just committed a cardinal sin, right? We are trained not to do that.
Poor me.
No counterfactuals, no predicting the future. This is
right.
Isn't this the first day of grad school? We were taught this.
Yeah, and
why do you do this?
Right. Yeah, and yeah, why would we do history if we don't believe in that it has some?
Well, why would you break that rule of historians?
Because I'm a grim, pessimistic, miserable old guy
and boring. Jesus
and
Christ.
Boring.
I can't be friends with you at all.
No. Why do I believe it?
Yeah.
There's a lot of reasons. Some of them more substantial academic reasons. Some of them less substantial. I come to a point in my life, having taught now for nearly 40 years, where I think that what I've done for a living is futile.
Oh, no.
Useless.
Oh, no.
Futile.
Oh, no. Why?
I should have
been a boxer.
Been in the show. Well, no, I couldn't do that.
You should have been in Schmata.
I should have been the Schmata trade.
Which was your dad's business.
My father, my grandfather, and my daughter.
For the goyim in the audience, explain what Schmata is.
It means literally the rag trade. And it means just the clothing business. Whether retail, wholesale, making garments, selling garments.
Which was big among the Jews.
It was. That's what we did. Yeah. A lot of us, and many in my family. Yeah. I don't want to make it seem like I'm too pessimistic, but I am. I'm not one that believes that life gets better and better on any particular vector. No.
Really?
I think some things get easier, and some things get the surveillance state is a good example. For example,
that's a good one.
Global warming is a good example.
Possibly.
Not possibly.
We'll see.
We're going to see, and we're going to see soon.
We'll see. When it actually happens, I will believe it.
You live in California. Pay attention to the hills.
I have. Anyway. That's a longer story.
And Venice is not a one-off.
Yeah.
That's not. In the words of Willie Loman, the woods are burning, boys.
There is a debate about why those fires started.
Sure.
But we won't talk about that.
But it doesn't have to do with sweeping the forest the way the Finns do.
Yeah, I don't know about that. Okay, so anyway, racism, why forever? Why must we always be racist?
All right, let me back off and say, must we always be racist? Okay, I don't know. Have we always been? Has there always been a strong element of it in American life?
Sure.
Yeah, and it keeps coming back in new forms and in new ways. Have we transcended it some? Yeah, we have. Absolutely.
Do you not see a general decline of it since the 1960s?
If you ask me, let me think of it a little different way. And again, I don't want to confuse bigotry with structural or racism. Is it better to be alive as an African American person?
How do you define bigotry? Sorry.
By bigotry, I mean just personal hatred. Personal feeling that one group is inferior to another group.
How is that different than race? Oh, I see. As opposed to structural racism.
So the question is, when was it better to be alive if you're African American, now or 1955? I would certainly say, and again, I'm not black, so maybe I'm not the one who should say, but yeah, give me now. Absolutely, give me now. Yeah. I don't think most African Americans would say
just
that.
Ask African Americans, would they rather live under segregation?
Exactly.
Formal legal segregation.
Exactly.
And that seems plain. Yeah.
It seems plain, and it was plain back in the 1950s. Mm-hmm. The Defender was constantly saying, come north.
However, just to complicate this even further, now that you mentioned the Defender, right? The Defender was a black-owned newspaper, black-run newspaper. It was a black newspaper. Owned, edited, and written, right, by black people.
Mostly.
Yeah, almost entirely. And there were black, thriving, vibrant black newspapers in every single city in this country.
That's right.
And there were also, during segregation, there were also thriving black business districts in every city, especially in the South.
Yes.
So thriving business districts.
Well, thriving's a little strong, but yes, there were small businesses that people could go into and tradespeople, barbers, absolutely.
Compared to now, thriving and vibrant.
Yes.
Right? And there were also major national companies.
You sound like the pessimist, not me.
Ebony and Jay. Well, maybe. No, on this point I am. Maybe. I don't know if I'm pessimistic, but Ebony and Jet were national magazines that were black owned.
Yes,
you know,
that's
they
true.
were on pretty much every African American coffee table for
Well,
decades.
Let's not forget things like baseball teams.
And the Negro Leagues,
Yep.
right, were doing really well,
Yep.
really, really well.
Yep.
And a lot of baseball fans, including me, you know, missed that in some ways.
The annual East-West game in Comiskey Park every
Yeah.
year, the All-Star game.
So
the Negro Leagues-
segregation actually wasn't all bad. And in fact, I have heard many black people of an age who are old enough to remember it, you know, kind of miss those days, miss those parts of it. Because segregation wasn't just white cops beating the crap out of black people in the streets. I mean, there was a lot of self-organization going on, a little self-formation of the black community that was quite exciting for a moment.
But it was white cops beating black people in the streets
certainly
and
was the
lynching
case.
and lynching over 4,000
There's no
people.
doubt, and they were not allowed to drink at certain water fountains, and much of the physical space of those cities was barred to them, and they were not allowed to do all sorts of things that white people were. So of course,
And own the
it was
best land.
Absolutely,
And if you got a little big for your britches and owned a little too much, you could be lynched.
no doubt about it. No doubt about it.
And
So,
God forbid a black man should say good morning
Right.
and look a white woman in the eye and say something like that. God forbid that should happen.
So what I'm saying, what I'm not giving is a defense of segregation. I am 1,000% opposed to any state-sanctioned segregation of any kind, which is what it was. I am simply saying that separation, or no, what I am saying is that I'm not so much of a fan of integration. I'm skeptical of integration, and what I really don't like is assimilation, where and you've written about this, all the people become the same.
Yeah, no, it's true.
Yeah,
Yeah, no, and you are joined by Marcus Garvey and Malcolm X and some pretty reputable, interesting thinkers.
The black nationalists and I get along.
Yeah,
even to this day. In fact, after I go up to Evanston and I'm interviewing a black nationalist who actually likes my book, which is quite interesting. But I'm not sure if I let you finish answering why we're always going to be racist.
I don't know if I have, and I just think it's, do I really absolutely believe that? Well, no, I don't know. Just seems like we have been for a long time, and that was my point. My point was that, again, that metaphor was carefully chosen, a shape-shifting demon that it changes. It's not always the same. Will we always be as bad? No, we won't. We've clearly gone through periods where things were much, much better, and still are. I think you're right, but I'm pretty worried. I am pretty worried.
I mean, there certainly is a resurgence of race thinking going on, but that's both on the left and the right, I've noticed.
Yes, I think that's right.
Yeah, and that I agree with you. I'm very nervous about that. And I could see that going badly. I could see a decline. Well, I think we already have seen a decline in race relations. I hate that term, but I'll use it here. So I'm not totally opposed to what you're thinking here. It's a nervous moment.
I think it is. It is.
Yeah.
That's a very well put, a nervous moment. I'll add one more thing. Why am I pessimistic? I'm Jewish.
There you go.
Yeah.
You have reason to be.
Yeah.
The eternal pessimists for good reason.
Well, we've had our ups and downs.
That's right. I'm only a quarter Jewish, so I'm just a quarter anxious.
Okay. Fair enough.
What you told me before we started recording about your next project that you're working on now, what is it?
Well, there's actually two. I only mentioned one. One is I want to do a book called Violent Men, which is some pieces I've written before. I wrote an article a long time ago
I
about.
lust for this book. I can't wait for it.
Oh, you're going to be so disappointed. I wrote a book a long time, an article a long time ago about eye gouging on the southern frontier that still gets used a lot in classes. Eye gouging matches.
This is you. I love it.
And before Scorsese and the gangs of New York, I actually wrote an article about Butcher Bill Poole and street fighting in New York. So I've done some of this stuff, and I'll do a little more. One person I might include, I'm thinking about, and this is sort of off the wall, is a man named Thomas Pickens Brady. I talk a little bit about him in the Till book, who was a judge in Mississippi who, when Brown came down, the Brown versus the Board of Education decision came down, he wrote a little booklet called Black Monday, which became, as they say, the Magna Carta of the Citizens Council movement, the movement against integration in the of the Southern schools and what was called the Southern way of life. Brown was seen as the first blow that this was going to be the first blow against Jim Crow, Southern segregation, the Southern way of life. And Brady wrote this little book. And what's so interesting about it to me is it goes back to something we talked about. It's very heavily, Brady went to Yale. He didn't study with William Graham Sumner, but he studied with a student, an acolyte of William Graham Sumner. And Brady writes this little book, Black Monday, in the 1950s, and it's like it could have come out of the 20s. All the things they were saying about Italians and Poles and Jews and so on, Greeks and Chinese, is in this little book. It's all of the kind of arguments that were used against other immigrants are here now turned on African Americans. And this is nothing new, of course, but black inferiority. That's basically what it is. But it's the same intellectual apparatus that was turned on us, way back when, just a few decades before. And that becomes really the spark for the Citizens Council movement, which is the Southern resistance to integration.
Because what was the discourse that was similar to anti-immigrant discourse?
It's come straight out of Madison Grant, Lathrop Stoddard, all those guys from the 20s.
My audience knows Madison Grant, just for the few who don't. 1916 passing of the Great Race divided Europe into three races. The Alpines, the Nordics, and the Mediterraneans became the basis for the 1924 Immigration Act, which barred immigration from Southern and Eastern Europe for 40 years. So you're saying, but wait, so we had scientific racism in full flight.
Oh, absolutely,
in regards to Negroes at that point. So what was the inflection that was different?
It's just there in his writing. It's he uses the same metaphors. He refers to them. He talks about, he in writing about African Americans, it's not just like scientific racism coming out of the 19th century. It's like the anti-immigrant stuff. What he writes, what he uses is coming out of the...
in what way? Like, how is it different? How is the scientific racism against Negroes discourse different than the anti-immigrant discourse?
It's not, except a lot of it is not. It's African Americans instead of Jews, instead of, it's any kind of race mixing. It's the danger of any kind of race mixing, of the impure blood with the pure blood. Any amount of it will destroy the pure blood. Okay. And again, you're right. This is not new.
Oh, I see that.
It's not new, but a lot of his references are old stuff for Americans.
Yeah, the mixing. Okay, so for immigrants, I'm just thinking. So for immigrants, of course, obviously there was a threat of mixing because they were new to our shores, and then in particular, the Jews and the Italians decided to open jazz clubs.
God forbid.
And dance with white women, which was the major opposition to jazz in the 1920s. With African Americans, they had been more or less effectively segregated until the 1950s. So it makes sense to me that until the 1950s, we don't quite have that discourse that's dominant. But now it looks like with 54, and by the way, 54 is Brown v. Board of Education, mandating integration at least in the schools. And then the year after that is Emmett Till. And then the African American population becomes, militant in many ways. And then you have the rise of Martin Luther King right at that moment too. Of course, it becomes a real threat, a real possibility that there will be integration of not just Italians and Jews and Greeks and Russians with us, living with us. It's going to be these Negroes, right?
Right.
Okay.
And yeah, that's so and the reason I want to write about it is because he's not a violent man. He is explicitly no, we're not like the Klan. We don't hide our identity. We are not violent. And this goes back to your point about legitimated legal violence of one kind or another. It might not be physical violence, but that sort of thing. And let me just mention also that what I really also want to do is I'd like to write a joke book.
A joke book?
Not original jokes. This is a long story. I was on leave and teaching in Finland for a year on a Fulbright about 10, 12 years ago. And I started, it's quiet at night in Finland, in Helsinki. And I started writing down every joke I can remember.
Not a great town, I've heard.
Oh, I love Helsinki.
Really? Okay.
I love Helsinki.
This is where they draw blood, right?
That's true.
They have those cupping things.
A few people still do that. Yeah. No, it's a great.
And alcoholism is about like 90% of the population.
Something like that. Metal bands are big.
And the sun never comes out. Yeah, death metal is invented there.
Yeah, it's wild. It's just
like a dark place to me in many ways.
And I told you, I'm a dark dude. So.
Dark and boring. Okay.
That's right. So I started writing down every joke I could remember because I don't have a great memory, but I have a very good memory for jokes. And it was, I remembered a lot of them. And I sort of let people know I was interested in this, and friends would tell me jokes. And I'd write them down. Yeah. And it's a very, very long Word document of nothing but jokes, right? But I don't know what I'll do with it. I have no idea. I might do nothing with it. but I can't do anything with it while I'm employed at a Jesuit university. Because they are so vulgar, so foul, so lovely and wonderful and poetic, many of them. I can't publish something like that.
Well, that's right. You're at Loyola.
Yeah.
Which is
even if I were anywhere else,
Catholic university.
This does go back to some of the sensitivities you were addressing before, oversensitivity. Yeah. A lot of these jokes are pretty nasty. So I'm not sure what to do with them exactly.
Nasty, like sexually nasty.
Sexually nasty, just in all kinds of ways. Just, I mean, that's what humor is. Humor is about violating taboos. That's what it does.
That's right.
I mean, what does Freud say that it's humor is about rage and aggression, and that's not all of it, but a lot of it is.
I'm quite sure about this. My major influence in terms of the direction of my career as a historian, as a scholar, as an intellectual, is Richard Pryor. More than any other historian, certainly. Present company accepted, maybe, but
no, one of the. Well, I always think of it as one of the two great comic geniuses. The other would be George Carlin.
Yeah, sure, and even among sort of theorists and philosophers, everybody knows I'm sort of famous for loving Michel Foucault. But and I've often joked, but not joked. This is totally true. My two influences are Pryor and Foucault. But Pryor was prior to Foucault. I mean, he was my first influence, and just the way I approach history and the questions I ask. See, that's the thing I love about your work, is that you and I are interested in the same questions. Yeah. We don't always answer them in exactly the same way.
I think that's right.
And it's very hard to find someone who's even interested in our questions, in our profession, in my experience.
Yeah, no, I think that's or let's say we're not marginalized. That's too strong, but we're an acquired taste.
Minority. I would say that. Okay. We're a minority.
Okay.
Sometimes an oppressed minority. I just looking over your CV, your bibliography, the books you've written, the work you've done, the theme, until you do the joke book, although maybe even within, it might still emerge, is violence.
Violence, people who are marginalized, one way or another, off and on gender and masculinity in different ways. I mean, well, who is that mother of all the laborers? People calling her mother. That stuff all keeps coming up.
Why violence?
I don't know. That's a good question.
Decades of studying it.
Yeah, I know.
About it,
I know. I hate
obsessing.
And I hate violence.
You do?
Oh God, yeah. I'm not. I mean, I can like watching a boxing match. Sure,
that's violent.
Yeah, that's violent. Going to a Tarantino film. Yeah, I can do that.
I can barely do that.
Yeah. Well, there's good reason not to.
They bother me more than boxing and in the UFC.
I think that's right, though. I think that's fair. I think that's right. But for whatever reason, I don't know. I mean, I really don't know, and I've thought about this. And by being fascinated by it, I don't mean that I love to watch violence or anything. I don't, but I'm really appalled by it. And it's, when you were talking about state violence, it's kind of, my God, what have we become? What do we,
But your dad was violent.
Not
in front of you.
Not toward us, not in front of us, but at least his stories about himself when he was young. Yes, absolutely.
The way you write about him, it was central in his identity formation.
I think so.
You begin your very first book.
Yes.
With him.
Yes.
And his violence.
Yes, absolutely.
The first 3 paragraphs of your very first book are about that.
Yeah, kind of strange.
Maybe that explains a lot here.
Maybe it's between me and my shrink.
There you go. And me now. And the world now.
Well, as much of it as we can get.
Good. Elliot, you told me when I invited you to be on this show, you said, "Thank you, but I am really boring. I don't think you want me on this show."
Well, and I think I proved my case.
We will let the audience decide. We'll take a vote whether or not you're boring, and I'll let you know the results of that. But I'm pretty sure you're not, at least not to me. Thank you so much for doing this.
Well, thank you very much. And this is a mutual admiration society. I don't know if you noticed that this mug that I gave you to drink out of has a quote by James Baldwin, and I think that's true, what he says about history.
It says, this is James Baldwin, "The great force of history comes from the fact that we carry it within us, are unconsciously controlled by it in many ways, and history is literally present in all that we do." Yeah.
I think it's even on the mug.
I think we sort of demonstrated that in this conversation. So yeah, thanks.
Thank you very much.
This is the Unregistered podcast, and I'm Thaddeus Russell. To experience the new Renegade University, go to renegadeuniversity.com. Thanks for listening.